The sequel to The Last of Us released on the 19th of June 2020 to very mixed reviews. Fans had been waiting 7 years since the release of the widely beloved first game, and many were let down by Part 2. Personally, I hadn't had the privilege of playing The Last of Us until last year. I began the first game and then almost immediately began Part 2, so I don't have the same experience as a lot of fans when it comes to building expectations for the second game. I went into it blind, so I can understand how jarring it might have been for people who had been connected to these characters for years and had built up their own ideas of who they would become. For me, Part 2 was unlike any game I'd ever played. It was only in Part 2 I began to get really invested in the world of The Last of Us. While the first game had certainly left an impression, Part 2 hooked me and made me fall completely in love with these games. Through multiple replays, both of these games and their characters have grown to mean so much to me. I want to start off by saying Part 2 isn't for everyone. It takes a very different path in comparison to the first game, and not everyone is going to love a super grim tone. But I don't think the developers made Part 2 for everyone. They told the story that they wanted to tell, knowing it wouldn't click with everyone, and I'm so grateful they did. Part 2 is my favorite game I've ever played. That's not to say it's without its flaws, but I think the positives vastly overlook the negatives. I was blown away after finishing Part 2 for the first time, and after looking online I didn't understand where most of the hate was coming from. Some of the criticism for Part 2 is also people complaining about needless diversity, which I don't feel the need to touch on much. LGBT people and people of color exist. It's not shoving a political agenda in your face to simply show these people in a story, and it's amazing representation for communities that have been so underrepresented in the past, especially in a community like gaming. With all that being said, let's get into what I love about Part 2. Before we dive into analyzing the story and writing of Part 2, I want to touch on some smaller details that really made the game for me. Feel free to skip ahead to Chapter 2. One of the first things you notice when loading up Part 2 is the incredible score. Gustavo... I'm not even going to try to pronounce that, scored the first game as well. He absolutely knocked it out of the park both times. The brooding score and the twanging guitar captures the desolate feel of these games so well, not to mention the ties the instrument has with Joel and Ellie. So many parts of these games are already incredibly emotionally gripping, which are elevated tenfold by the score. It's great at drawing you into the world even more. Next to the score is the soundtrack. The team selected the perfect songs for this game, Future Days by Pearl Jam being the standout choice. The lyrics perfectly capture the tormented relationship between Ellie and Joel, and the stripped-down cover Ellie performs of Take On Me is beautiful and applies to Ellie and Dina's relationship so well. I also really love how these characters are designed. You can tell a lot of love and care was put into them from the amount of details. The moth on Ellie's tattoo tying into the Firefly mantra, when you're lost in the darkness, look for the light. Or the scars on Lev's head from how nervous he was shaving it. The patches and pins still clinging to Ellie's backpack as a constant reminder. Lev's style getting progressively more modern as he moves away from his old life. And Abby wearing Owen's backpack in Santa Barbara. I'm sure there's plenty more small details I'm missing. I also think Naughty Dog are really amazing at capturing facial expressions and emotions. So much can be said with just a simple glance, and I think this really stands out in Ellie and Dina's conversation before Ellie heads out to Santa Barbara. Even if you hate the game, you have to admit the graphics and animation are stunning. There's so much detail and thought built into every environment and action. The decay of every building in the background serves as a constant reminder of the setting we are in. The very first section of the game where you play as Joel riding through the open field with Tommy leaves an incredible first impression on the player with the sun shining down over Jackson. Naughty Dog has always been at the forefront of graphical enhancement with their games, and The Last of Us Part 2 is no exception. The gameplay in itself is a massive improvement from the first game too. It takes aspects from Part 1 and enhances them massively. Enemy encounters are completely unique to the player, and it truly depends on your playstyle. Usually you can choose to maneuver through different encounters with either stealth or combat. Though difficult, there's large sections of the game you can avoid altogether by sneaking. Melee has also had a massive upgrade, now introducing the ability to dodge. The gunplay in Part 2 is amazing and is easily accessible to players who may not be as well versed in video games as well. We can also see the two protagonists that we play as, Abby and Ellie, have different fighting styles, and it's beneficial to play to their strengths. Abby is great with physical, face-to-face encounters, while Ellie might be more suited to fight from afar. Having this type of variety between playable characters is great, and it opens up the player to experience new ways of fighting they otherwise wouldn't have. The entire game is really well voice acted too. Ashley Johnson and Troy Baker breathed so much life into Joel and Ellie, and those characters wouldn't exist the same without them. Shannon Woodard is also great as Dina too. Sound design works wonders in this game, and it's used to great effect. I think Joel's death through Ellie's perspective is really great on that level. The sound of the clickers are utterly terrifying and as unique as ever. Even the sound of glass shattering is realistic. Human enemies will call their fallen companions by name. as if they're the protagonist of their own little story, which ties into one of Part 2's central themes of perspective. The Infected are also built upon in the sequel, the greatest addition being the Rat King, which was an incredible boss fight. The entire atmosphere leading up to that part of the game was so creepy, and the initial reveal made me shit my fucking pants. Getting to unload everything you had as Abby was so fucking sick. Trying to collect ammo and supplies made fight, while other types of Infected were jumping at you made it a super gnarly fight overall. All the kills in Part 2 are super gory and fleshed out, even the death sequences for Ellie and Abby. The Seraphite's introduction is so chilling. Out of context, the whistling is harmless, but when you're trying to creep past them, it's truly terrifying. Lighting is also used to incredible effect in this game. The sewer scenes in the hospital have stark red lighting that reflect the creepy atmosphere, and they allow these parts of the game to stand out among the rest. The cover art for Part 2 is also something I really love. It stands out in comparison to other games. All it shows is Ellie's pained expression, which sums up the game perfectly. It's about her grief and the complicated way she deals with it. There are loads more little details packed into Part 2, like the loading screen changing to Abby and Lev's boat on Catalina Island after finishing the game, or how the game begins and ends on the exact same guitar. But it would take forever to cover every single one, so let's move on to Chapter 2. Super. One of the main critiques made about Part 2 is Joel's death. More specifically, how early and violent it was. Joel's death being this early on sets up a few things. The first and most obvious is establishing the entire premise of the game, which hinges on Joel dying. Part 2 would have been a very difficult game to make if they had kept Joel alive. His character arc has been completed in the first game. He went from being a father who had lost everything to learning how to love again. Joel had already come full circle. The player has a pre-established connection with him from the first game. You've become invested in his character. His death puts you right in Ellie's shoes. You feel every ounce of rage, hatred, and need for justice. You feel like you've just been robbed of something. Instead of spending the whole game with Joel, he's gone within the first few hours. Killing off a central character this early also lets us know that no character is safe whatsoever. Any of them could be killed off at any moment. The player feels an undeniable rage towards Abby. Although we'll come to learn, her actions are completely justified. Part 2 frames Abby as our central antagonist, even though Ellie and Joel are hardly any better than her. Abby isn't some senseless monster killing without need. Joel took something from her, so she wanted to take something from Joel. Like we'll see with Ellie later, she felt she was unable to get her justice until Joel was dead. The first time we experience this scene is through Ellie. The sound design and framing take us through her emotion. Any other voices are entirely blocked out by her own, screaming out in pain for Joel. In this moment, her life doesn't matter. Only the loss of Joel's does. The score drowns out everything else with a droning screech. We hear exactly what Ellie's hearing. The second time we experience this scene is through Abby. We play as a younger version of her, finding out her father's just been murdered. We cut from her crying into Owen's arms, to exacting revenge on the man responsible. She raises the golf club, expecting to feel some sort of great triumph and relief. She can finally get her revenge after all these years of grief and pain. She swings the club. And then there's nothing. Abby stares blankly at Joel's body for a few seconds while all the commotion goes on in the background. The camera focuses in on only her, looking down at the mess she's made. The only thing her revenge has done is make her feel more hollow. The only thing she's achieved is bringing more hurt into the world. The pain you cause others only brings you more pain. After killing Joel, Abby's nightmares don't go away. Only saving Lev and Yara makes her feel whole again, which we'll come back to later. This scene acts as both the beginning of Ellie's revenge story and the subsequent end of Abby's. It's one of the first examples of shifting perspective, which is a huge theme in Part 2. Depending on who we experience Joel's death through, the scene is drastically different. A lot of players complain about the way Joel was led to his death. Joel, an originally guarded man in the first game, told a complete stranger his first name and then stood in the middle of an open room surrounded by them. Firstly, 4 years have passed since we last left Joel. In that time, he's become a valued member of Jackson, and a lot of that time has been spent helping outsiders. But that's besides the point, because realistically, none of that matters. Joel's death was coming no matter what, despite how smart he might have been able to play it. Joel murdered hundreds of people in the first game. The consequences of his actions were always going to catch up to him. If it wasn't Abby seeking revenge, it would have been someone else. Even if Joel had lied about his first name and had led Abby's group back to Jackson, how long would it have taken before Abby found out the truth? Or even if Joel had somehow managed to kill Abby's entire group by himself, how long would it have taken for other members of the WLF to come searching for him? There was no way out of Joel's death. I think the large shift in tone was what was most jarring for a lot of people transitioning into Part 2. It's a relentless game, showing you the worst days of these characters' lives after they get knocked down time and time again. Each time you think their circumstances can't get worse, they do. Part 2 pushes these characters to their very limits, seeing just how far they'll go when they put in enough pain. There's little hope and light through all the darkness of Part 2. This is especially an adjustment in comparison to Part 1, which had an overall tone of love and hope despite their overwhelmingly negative circumstances, which is why a lot of people connected to the game in the first place. Part 1 focused on an inseparable bond being built between two strangers, while Part 2 focused on that bond being broken. Part 1 was about how far you'd go for someone you loved. Part 2 was about the things you do for someone you hate. The dark and somber tone of Part 2 definitely isn't for everyone, but we can see hints of it seeping through in the first part as well. The uncertain ending on a lie. It's hopeful, but with misery underneath, knowing the foundation of Joel and Ellie's relationship is built on a lie that will one day crumble. Part 2 leaves off with Ellie alone, walking into the woods. On the surface, it's a devastating ending, but there's hope to be found in it. Ellie walks off to the road of redemption. She was able to walk away from the suffocating darkness that led her to almost kill Abby, the same darkness that drove away Dina and JJ. Ellie has the rest of her life to rebuild herself, to find her home again. She can rebuild her relationships and begin to find a sense of purpose in life. The ending to part 2 is sad and uncertain, but it also tells us that it's never too late to try again. We also leave off on a hopeful ending for our other protagonist, Abby. It's heavily implied that she and Lev end up on Catalina Island with the other Fireflies, building a new life for themselves and fighting for something that matters. She's finally been able to give up her life as a vengeful mercenary and has become the good person she always had the ability to be, the same good person Owen always saw. She managed to save Lev, in turn saving herself. By the end of the game, Ellie and Abby are both broken and beaten, but they're well on their way to healing. Over the course of The Last of Us, we've grown up with Ellie. We meet Ellie when she's a naive 14-year-old, and we follow her all the way into her 20s. It makes sense the games will mature with her along the way. Abby Anderson is a very complicated character. She's introduced through the murder of Joel. The game instantly paints her as a villain, somebody you're meant to despise, and Naughty Dog succeeded at this. Many players hated Abby at first, myself included. We then follow Ellie through the next 3 days, hunting down Abby at any cost to exact her revenge. When we finally meet Abby in the movie theater, something strange happens. We shift to Abby's perspective. We see her as a young girl, tracking down her father who will soon be killed. As soon as we see the Firefly Hospital in the background, we feel an immense amount of dread, as any Last of Us player will know what's about to come. We then spend the next 3 days playing as Abby, which came as a shock to a lot of players. We shift perspectives to her, instead viewing Ellie as the villain, and eventually culminating in a fight between the two where you fight as Abby. We see through the character of Abby what happens when a revenge mission is fulfilled. She doesn't get any closure. She's still haunted by everything that has happened, and her friends die as a result of her vengeance. Closure and healing comes from growth and change as a person, not with revenge. Abby is, without a doubt, a flawed character much like Ellie and Joel. If I had any complaints, it would be that Abby's section of the game is a little meandering. Through Ellie's section, we charge ahead with one clear goal in mind: find Abby. When we play as Abby, she's already fulfilled her goal of killing Joel. We go about a normal day in her life, until we meet Yara and Lev, where the pace really picks up. You can't talk about Abby's growth as a character without mentioning Yara and Lev. They're the catalyst for Abby's character development, and they completely challenge her worldview. For years, she's been fixated on seeing scars as the enemy. Whenever she saw one, she'd wipe them out without hesitation. This changes when she meets the siblings, who save Abby from death. She realizes that these people are human, above all else. The relationship that develops between Abby and Lev strongly mirrors that of Joel and Ellie in Part 1. Abby, much like Joel, is a closed-off warrior who lost her only family. That is, until she meets Lev, who like Ellie is a child in need of protection. Abby and Lev both give each other something. Lev teaches Abby how to open her heart, while Abby becomes family to Lev after he's lost his. We see through this relationship how Abby learns that love is more powerful at healing than revenge ever could be. After the murder of Joel, Abby still has frequent nightmares. She was so driven by her quest for justice, she never gave a thought to how she'd feel after. Abby's still haunted by the death of her father, and now she's haunted by her own actions as well. It's only after Abby goes back to help Lev and Yara that her nightmares go away. Her conscience is clear. She feels that her father can look down on her proudly now. For Abby, Lev is the light in her darkness. By the end of the game, protecting him is her only priority. Nothing will stand in her way. Abby kills people from her own community to protect him, because as she says,
"You're my people!"
Lev is the one that breaks the cycle of hate. He's the reason Abby turns around and decides not to kill Dina. He gives her a reason to be a better person, because Abby can't be her own reason. All in all, Abby and Ellie have the same motivation: revenge. They're both driven to do awful things in the name of it. They're just at different parts of their story. While Abby is able to make peace with her father's death by saving Lev and Yara, Ellie makes peace with Joel's by letting Abby live. They were both children growing up in a world that treated them unfairly, and the only way they knew how to deal with their issues was violence. Obviously, not every player is going to connect with Abby, and that's okay. The game never asks you to like her, it just asks you to understand her. It wants you to understand what drives her to do the things she does, and how in her story, Joel and Ellie are the villains. But in real life, there are no bad guys. Everybody is the hero of their own story. Ellie sparing Abby was a choice that seemed to be lost on a lot of people. We follow Ellie, battered and covered in blood, on a grim journey across Santa Barbara. She's crossed the country and killed dozens of people and infected alike just to get to Abby so she can finish what she started. In the past year, Ellie had built a nice, idyllic farm life with Dina and their son JJ. On day one of Seattle, Dina shares her dream with Ellie of living out on the countryside, and they finally achieve it. Miraculously, they've survived everything that's happened to them. Ellie has everything she could ever want, but she can't let it go. Ellie has severe PTSD, and it's almost like everywhere she goes, she can hear Joel's screams. She can't eat, she can't sleep, She can't enjoy the family she's built for herself. Against Dina's wishes, she seeks out Abby and loses her family in the process. Ellie goes to California not to avenge Joel, but because her inactivity isn't helping her heal. When Ellie gets to Abby, it's not what she's expecting. In her head, she's been building up a massive confrontation where she'll do anything to defeat this evil that's been haunting her for the past year. Instead, she finds Abby tied up and on the brink of death. She cuts Abby down, in utter shock. Abby walks straight past Ellie to Lev, who she cuts down and carries to shore. Ellie follows closely behind. She watches as Abby loads Lev into their boat. Ellie doesn't make any moves against her until she sees the blood. The blood that reminds her of Joel. She remembers the woman in front of her as the same one that took Joel away from her. She tells Abby to fight her. Killing Abby without a fight wouldn't leave Ellie with any sense of satisfaction. She needs the big confrontation she's been building up in her head so she can finally rest. By this point, Ellie has become so disillusioned with her rage and guilt that she truly believes killing Abby is the only way to move forward. When Abby refuses to fight her, Ellie threatens Lev's life, who Abby would do anything for. The two leap into a brutal brawl, both with almost nothing left. They fight dirty, doing anything to win. Both are weak, and Ellie loses part of her fingers, though eventually she gets a hold of Abby, holding her head underwater and watching her struggle. Abby, after months of torture and slavery, has become too weak to pull herself up. For a split second, Ellie loses herself completely. And then she sees Joel. She recalls the last talk they had about forgiveness. Ellie wants to be the type of person who forgives, though it doesn't come easy to her. Joel has such a lingering effect on Ellie, showing her what it means to be loved and cared for, that for a second all that guilt and resentment fades away. She knew there was no bringing him back. The death of Abby would only haunt her even more. If Ellie killed Abby, she would have completely lost who she was. She'd be taking away someone's guardian. Ellie killing Abby would have taken away the part of life that Joel gave her. The cycle of revenge would have kept continuing on until somebody had the courage to try for forgiveness. Ellie was already so shattered by the violence she had caused. Brutally murdering all of Abby's friends had taken its toll as well. We see that killing Nora leaves her physically shaking when she returns to the theater, and killing the pregnant Mel has a devastating effect on how she sees herself. When Ellie releases Abby, she's finally accepting Joel's death as well. She's able to forgive him for lying to her in the same moment she's able to forgive Abby. She sits in the water alone as Abby drives off. I see a lot of people angry at the fact Abby wasn't killed at the end of the game, but what kind of message would that have sent? Ellie would never have been able to find peace. She never would have been able to forgive Joel, and by extension herself. There was no way to make Joel's death right, but there was a way to keep moving forward. The Last of Us Part 1 and 2 both end with a choice being made between killing someone or saving them. Joel has to save Ellie to keep his morality alive, while Ellie has to do the same by saving Abby. By the end, Ellie rediscovers her humanity, and we leave her on the road to redemption. In our very last scene, we return with Ellie to her farmhouse, only to find it empty. Dina and JJ are gone, presumably moved back to Jackson, but Ellie's things are left behind. She picks up Joel's guitar and begins to play the same song we heard Joel play at the beginning of the game, though she can't hit most of the notes as she lost her fingers during her fight with Abby. Through all of her rage, she lost one of the only things that was connecting her to Joel. She puts down the guitar, picks up a bag, and walks away, leaving the memories of Joel and Dina behind to forge her own new path. Ellie finally has to start living for herself and finding her own purpose. She can then finally move forward as she has no other choice. She doesn't know if she can quite forgive Joel, but she'd like to try. The Last of Us Part 2 is a beautiful commentary on grief, loss, and forgiveness. It takes all the guilt and pain of losing someone you love and manifests itself into the journeys of Abby and Ellie. I understand why people dislike this game, but I'll never stop being thankful for the fact it exists. I think a lot of people misunderstand the intent behind this game. Its core message is not about revenge, it's about forgiveness and perspective. Ellie is able to forgive Abby, Joel, and even herself for surviving by the end. On a technical level, Part 2 works great as a sequel. It expands the world we already knew, opening us up to new factions and locations. It answers questions we had in the previous game and opens us up to so many more. It's a very ambitious story, and one that I'm so glad was told. It opens us up to more incredible character-driven stories in the future. The Last of Us Part 2 is a deeply human story. You have to get inside the heads of the characters and deeply understand all their motivations to know why they act the way they do. Unlike the first game, which has a more cut-and-dry message, you have to decide how you feel about the ending of Part 2 and what you take away from it. Both games in the series end with Ellie's uncertainty, heading off into an unknown future with Joel watching over her. At multiple points in the game, the line, "If I ever were to lose you, I'd surely lose myself," is sung. This is especially true in the case of Ellie and Joel. After Joel's death, Ellie almost loses all of her humanity and everything else she has in her conquest for revenge. She's willing to lose a huge part of herself to get what she believes will be justice, but as we see with Abby right after killing Joel, it doesn't fix anything. It forces the cycle of revenge to continue, and Ellie was strong enough to break it. The Last of Us Part 2 is an exploration of love in its most painful form, loss. How far will we go to compensate for what we've lost? How much of ourselves are we willing to lose to get it back? Ellie's character arc ends with her worst fears coming true as a result of her unwillingness to forgive.
I'm scared of ending up alone.